Okay, in this fourth video, we're going to look at then the problems that can occur in both internally and externally, but can be diagnosed from the skin. All right, so disease, disorder, injury of integument. So hopefully, again, disease you won't have to deal with, or disorders, but you probably have dealt with injury of your integument, and we want to think about what preceded, what was the response that went on, and why. So again, your skin it takes a beating, right? It's positioned to encounter the world. Cancer mostly from excessive energy from UV radiation, but damages from a variety, high energy burns, chemical burns, right? Bacteria, fungi, you name it. Any injury or stress to any tissue, but here we're focusing on tissues of the skin, causes inflammation. So this you've seen over and over probably if you're like me, right? And there's four cardinal signs to inflammation. This, of course, is your response to tissue injury, right? And redness, heat, pain, and swelling are what we consider the four cardinal signs, all right? So we'll look at those, and we'll look at this process of cell injury throughout this this section of the chapter. All right. So skin cancer, a disease, right? So we said diseases, disorders, injuries. So diseases. This is a problem, a big problem for people. Again, light-skinned people, especially because we have with less melanin produced and less darkened melanin, we don't have as much absorption capacity. And that leaves us prone to damage. It's one of the reasons why I wear a hat and sunglasses here in Texas, right? So, we did discuss cancer. It's a very sobering subject, but when we had to discuss about this idea of cell cycle that has lost control. And I just go on to say that, there's a 20% chance that this skin cancer will arise in the common population, with the depletion of our ozone, which is this oxygen, specialized oxygen molecule, helps to absorb the radiation from the sun. This loss of this protective layer to our atmosphere has increased our exposure to UV radiation, and there's also, again, chemicals that we encounter in our environments and just other sources of radiation that can lead to damaging skin cells, and when they try to repair themselves, they can make changes, mutations, and sometimes those changes are in those tumor suppressor genes or proto-oncogenes, right? So I say here again, melanin protects us, but DNA mutations accumulate due to this UV damage and over time, right? Because time is the #1 predictor of cancer, right? As I say here, for age, there's an increased likeliness. So your risk factors for skin cancer include melanin content, where this is inherited, so you inherit this risk. And the amount of exposure to sunlight, so your lifestyle, and of course I said age, just because mutations, the longer you live, the more mitosis you do, the higher the probability, right? So here we are looking at types of cancer. It's not a pleasant thing to talk about, but the good news is that you can see it, unlike cancers that occur to internal structures. And therefore you can address it sooner, and that gives you a better prognosis. So there are 3 types we talk about. And we want to know these based on their likeliness to metastasize, okay? And so we refer to these as cutaneous carcinomas. Okay, so cutaneous membrane, cutaneous carcinomas, right? So again, tumor cells. So basal cell carcinoma is the most common, all right? And this makes sense because those cells in the stratum basale are actually doing mitosis on a regular basis. They are the most likely to be undergoing division. They are the most likely to have a mutation occur. All right, they grow outwards. Also good news, yay, because remember there's no blood vessels on the outside, right? If they'd grown inwards, they could easily access lymph and blood, but they tend to grow outwards and are very visible. Of course, they're on areas where we expose ourselves to sunlight. We generally have more exposure on these parts of our body. Then we also have squamous cell carcinoma, and this is when the keratinocytes, right, that are on superficial, right, so above the stratum basale, they normally don't divide. They don't continue dividing, they just make a lot of keratin. They'll begin dividing. So again, a mutation occurs in their DNA and they lose control of cell cycle. These are much more likely to metastasize. They will tend to move into the body and invade blood vessels and lymph. The good news is, again, as you see these, you're very likely to see these, and we often can just excise, remove the abnormal cells, irradiate the surrounding area in the hopes of really killing any abnormal cells that we didn't cut out. All right? This cutaneous melanomas, right, they're much more dangerous. All right? So this is a problem with, yes, the melanocytes, right? It's the melanocytes, they don't tend to divide, right? I said we all have about the same numbers, and they stay pretty much always making melanin. But they can mutate, and that mutation can lead to an uncontrolled return to division, and then continue to divide. All right? Generally, the cutaneous melanomas, again, they are bad, malignant. They're going to metastasize. They are the rarest, so that's the good news. They appear as these large, flat spreading lesions. All right? They are often on your back or limbs, again, areas that we have exposure to sunlight. All right? It is common for it to get into the blood and the lymph, and it is generally fatal. All right? So there's an acronym here, first 7 letters of the alphabet, right? So they tend to be, again, not symmetrical, so a strange appearance. The borders are irregular. Again, color is varied. You can see that easily here. Diameter larger than 6 millimeters. All right? They change in shape. They will start to elevate a little bit, as you can see here. They are firm to touch, and they will continue to spread. And you definitely want to seek help, medical help. All right? So skin disorders, that's really the disease we're going to focus on in this chapter. So the disorders, all right, they're, again, easily observed. They can indicate internal problems, right? Some examples are eczema, acne, seborrheic, dermatitis, inflammation of the dermis, psoriasis, cold sores, impetigo, scabies, hives, warts, lovely things like that, all right? You should know the cause for all these things covered on the following slides, and that's all. I mean, you don't have to know all the symptoms and everything, but the cause, and we're going to try to break it down. Very straightforward. All right, now eczema and dermatitis, it's going to be hard to know the cause because there can be a lot of things, so that doesn't make a really good test question. Here's a nice image, or not nice image if you don't like the thought of this, but it's, again, the itis means it's an inflammatory response. Allergies, infections, poor circulation, exposure to chemicals, heat, cold, sunlight, all can lead to eczema and dermatitis, right? They present as these dry, itchy patches. They swell, they flake, they can bleed, only because, again, you are rubbing off so much of the superficial epidermis. We treat these often with immunosuppressants because, again, your own immune system is aggravating the problem, and corticosteroid creams, which stabilize T cells, which seem to be predominantly responsible for this. All right, bacterial infections. This is much easier to know. And again, you don't have to know the specific species, genus and species of bacteria. Just know that all of these are caused by bacterial infections: acne, impetigo, decubitus ulcers, and scarlet fever. All right. So acne, again, exacerbated by hormones during adolescence, puberty, right? And we have this excess sebum, which is a food source, and it has antimicrobials, but certain bacteria take advantage of it. They love it, they eat it, they grow, they produce more themselves, and yeah, you get acne. The keratin from the cells can block, remember, because sebum is the whole cell being released from the gland too, so keratin and the sebum will block hair follicles, and you get what we call acne, right? Impetigo is a staph infection. It's easily transferred, and it enters through abrasions, so we have staphylococcus all over, right, on the surface of our body. It can't get in, but as soon as we've compromised it, our skin, then it does. Decubitus ulcers, or bed sores, right, or pressure ulcers. This is so called because the bony parts of our body put pressure on the blood flow to these areas if you stay in one position, and that pressure then means that there's less oxygen and nutrients delivered, so there's death of the subcutaneous and cutaneous membrane. And with that death, of the cells. Bacteria find this as a great food source. They invade, and you present with ulceration. And this is very dangerous because it leads to secondary bacterial infections. The bacteria start there, they enter the body, and then they're very difficult to control as they colonize other parts of the body. Scarlet fever it presents in the skin, but it's actually a respiratory problem. And the bacterial infection is internal, but there's a toxin that the bacteria produce, and this is released into the blood, and it manifests in the skin. So hence the reddish fever. All right, viral infections. Again, all you have to know is that these, right, rubiola, chickenpox, herpes, shingles, cold sores, all are viral infections. Okay, so again, viruses many times enter respiratory or GI. These are our respiratory routes. And again, the virus is it moves through the body once it gets in. And I said again, it's carried to the skin through the blood. You end up with these pustules, with measles, is what measles are, all over the skin. The virus can actually also enter into the central nervous system. Viruses always have this danger. Most of them do, I should say. Not always, but most of them. This is a problem. Chickenpox, again, there's a chickenpox virus, yeah. And it's in the herpes family. After the infection, the virus is dormant, but is activated upon trauma and stress, which leads to, of course, shingles. And this is elderly people who are immunocompromised, so that's why we tend to see that appear in them again. Cold sores, also from the herpes family, because there's a lot of different herpes viruses, right? And I give you herpes simplex 1. And it lives in us. Most people, 75% of us, are probably infected with this or more, all right? And it becomes activated by, again, stress events or immunocompromised events, and forms these lesions in the skin when the virus is active. All right? Discoloration to the skin. There's many things that can discolor the skin. I'm just giving you 2 here that are pretty common, cyanosis and jaundice. And so the cause, right, which I told you to know, of cyanosis is impaired circulation, so blood flow to the skin, or respiratory, because remember we talked about that contribution. The amount of oxygen associated with blood affects the color of skin. So cyanosis is a bluish color, and you tend to be have low oxygen capacity or carry low oxygen content to the blood. Jaundice, as I color it yellow here, is because you have an accumulation of the bilirubin, which is a byproduct of breaking down blood cells, which is what the liver does. But when the liver is compromised and can't do its job anymore, then the byproducts build up. So I give you a classic example, hepatitis, so inflammation of the liver, right? The liver can't function as well, as we don't break down the blood cells as efficiently, and the bile pigments aren't secreted into the small intestine, but circulate in the blood, right? Fungal infection, the only one is ringworm, because that's a common one. It's not the only fungus infection of the skin, but I'm just listing a few of these things to give you examples. So this manifests as a scaly inflammatory response, fairly common in certain areas of the skin. Genetics, so what things are caused by genetic problems? Well, psoriasis is a classic one. This is inherited and passed on to our children. And it results from an increase in cell division, but not a cancer, right? These cells that are dividing faster, right, than the normal 4-week turnover, as we talked about previously, have also manufacture an abnormal keratin. So again, a change in the gene, because keratin's a protein, so proteins are determined by our genes. And the dermal papillae start to elongate too. And so the appearance of all this is that you have this kind of silvery scales, and you have a very heavy stratum corneum that tends to, right, kind of shed. And as it sheds, of course, it exposes these invading dermal papillae where there's a lot of blood, and so bleeding is very common, which also puts us at risk for infections. All right, we're going to stop here on this video, and then we'll come back and finish up on the 5th video. Sorry I have to do that, but talking about injuries. And we're almost done, so hang tight.